Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little. I'm here today with the 137th episode of Weekly Poker Hand. Today we have another hand from a $500 buy-in tournament I recently played. I get Ace King again. I had Ace King in the previous hand. Folds around to me. I raise on the button to 500. And we have a tricky, aggressive guy in the big blind who elects to call. We are still playing 100, 200, so we are very deep stacked. Flop comes Ace Jack 8, same board. My opponent checks. I bet, again, the same 750. I think I could possibly go a little bit larger, as I mentioned in the previous episode of Weekly Poker Hand. This is a scenario where a tricky, aggressive guy will check raise some portion of the time, so I actually don't hate checking behind on this flop, but there are a lot of draws available. So for that reason, I do think betting is almost always going to be the right play. If this board was instead something like Ace Jack 3 with two diamonds, maybe checking behind would be a little bit better. But here with all of the draws available, I think betting is pretty mandatory. And our opponent does just call. That's nice. We have to assume we have the best hand pretty much every time. Turns a 9 of spades. So 2 diamonds, 2 spades on the flop, or on the board. Our opponent checks, and I like to check behind. It's important to realize that this is a horrible card for me. It may look fine because the flush didn't come in, but notice the double gut shot, Queen 10, gets there. Also notice Ace 9, Jack 9, and 9-8 all improve to beat me. And 10-7 of diamonds happens to get there. Also 10-7 of spades if our opponent had that. So there are a reasonable amount of hands that beat us. So in the previous episode of Weekly Poker Hand, make sure you go back and watch those if you have not. You can watch all of the past episodes with a video replay over at jonathanlittlepoker.com/WPH. In the previous episode, the turn was a pretty safe card. Here, this turn is a horrible card. And against a straightforward player, I would probably just still continue betting this. But against a tricky, aggressive player, I do not think that you want to be betting here, because if you bet and get raised, you have to realize that this is pretty much the bottom of your range, right? I mean, the real bottom of our range are draws, but we can still call with our draws. But you don't really want to be in a scenario where we're betting, where we are calling a check raise with everything we are betting with. We want to be folding some hands when we get check raised. Otherwise, your opponent can just check raise you with only premium hands and crush you. Of course, we are trying to adjust to our opponent a little bit, and we think this guy may be check raising a little bit too often, so for that reason, we have to call a little bit more often. And that's going to lead to us getting stacked or losing a lot of chips if we bet this turn. So imagine we do bet 2,000, our opponent check raises to 6,000, we call, then he jams the river. Well, we're pretty unhappy about that. So to sidestep that possible scenario, I think checking behind is by far the best play. We are going to get outdrawn on the river. Obviously, a queen, jack, 10, 8, 7 are all very bad. Also, any diamond is pretty bad, so there are a lot of cards we have to fade. But I think we need to check behind. River's a 4 of diamonds, not what we wanted to see at all. And our opponent checks. Okay, so now we have to decide if we want to go for value. If we expect our opponent to check raise us a decent amount of the time, I think we definitely want to check behind. But if we think that we can bet and our opponent will call with a lot of, or at least some worse made hands, primarily ace queen, ace 10, ace 7, ace 6, ace 5, ace 3, and ace 2, maybe king jack and queen jack. If we think he'll call a bet with those hands, I definitely like betting. A lot of players in the big blind shoes would value bet with a straight or a flush on the river. So I think we're going to have the best hand a lot of the time. However, again, if I get the vibe that this guy may like his hand a little bit more than normal, I'm definitely going to just check behind in this spot. So let's see if I do go for value. I do go for value. I bet 2,000 into the 2,800 pot with the ace king. And again, we're doing this because we do think he can conceivably call us with those worse aces and maybe a few jacks. I think that as we bet bigger in this spot, notice I bet 2,000 into the 2,800 pot, our opponent's going to be less inclined to check raise us. And I think that you want to make your opponent not check raise you very often in this spot when we have a bluff catcher, because unless you are planning to catch all the bluffs, which is not a bad play sometimes, if you're planning to fold to some of the check raises, then you typically want to be betting a little bit bigger to make it to where your opponent's not going to be so inclined to check raise. But notice if I bet something like 800 on this river, our opponent may view that as weak and start check raising a bunch. And if we did get check raised here after betting 800 on the river, I think we just have to call, and I don't really want to be in that spot. So to sidestep that spot, I think betting 2,000 is pretty nice, and I do think we can still get value with this bet size. This time he does call, so works out nicely. And he had the same ace-7. So 2 fun hands back-to-back on Weekly Poker Hand, 2 ace-kings. In this scenario, we elected to go for less value. We elected to check behind on the turn to make it to where we're not going to get check raised too often. But when our opponent does check the river, I think that's a very clear green light that we should be going for value. So that's going to be it for this episode of Weekly Poker Hand. Again, if you are not checking out my personal website over at jonathanlittlepoker.com on a weekly basis, definitely do so. I have an educational blog there where I usually type out an article or my thoughts on things that are going on in the poker world or something like that. I do that each week. Also, we have video blogs where I discuss my travels and life in general. And also we have announcements about new books and everything else I have going on. And also you can find the videos of Weekly Poker Hand there. So check out jonathanlittlepoker.com. I do a lot over there that I think you'll find fun to browse. So thank you very much, and I will talk to you next week.